Hello everyone. Welcome back to Easy Listening English. Before we begin, I want you to stop for a moment and think about something. How many times have you wanted to speak English, but your heart started racing, your mind suddenly went blank, and the words just wouldn't come out? Maybe you've spent months or even years studying grammar, memorizing vocabulary, and watching English videos, yet when a real conversation appears, you freeze. If that sounds familiar, then stay with me. Because in this lesson, I'm not going to teach you complicated grammar rules or thousands of difficult words. Instead, I'm going to show you why confident English speakers are not necessarily the people who know the most English. They're often the people who simply have the courage to speak before they're ready. Imagine being able to introduce yourself naturally, start conversations without fear, think directly in English, and speak with confidence even when you make mistakes. Imagine understanding more every day and feeling your English improve step by step without stress or frustration. That's exactly the journey we're starting together today. So relax your shoulders, take a deep breath, and remember one simple truth. You do not need perfect English to start speaking. You only need the willingness to begin. And by the end of this lesson, you may discover that the biggest thing holding you back was never your English at all. My name is Linda, and I am an American English teacher from Seattle, a city where people from many different backgrounds meet, work, and communicate every day. And because of that environment, I have spent years helping learners overcome one challenge that appears again and again regardless of age, nationality, or language level. Today's lesson is about the fear of speaking English, the invisible wall that stands between knowledge and communication, and I want to begin by sharing something important that many students find surprising when they first hear it. The greatest obstacle to speaking English is usually not vocabulary, grammar, or pronunciation, but fear itself, because fear has the power to convince intelligent and capable people that they are not ready. I have met learners who could read books, understand videos, and complete difficult grammar exercises, yet the moment someone asked them a simple question in English, their confidence disappeared. If this experience sounds familiar to you, then you are exactly where you need to be today, because this lesson is designed to help you understand that fear and begin replacing it with a healthier and more empowering mindset. I still remember one student who arrived in my classroom with a notebook filled with hundreds of English words, and from the outside, she appeared prepared and hardworking. However, whenever I asked her a simple question such as, "How are you today?" her face became tense, her breathing changed, and she looked as if she had suddenly forgotten everything she had learned. She later told me that her heart started racing every time she tried to speak English, and that she worried constantly about making mistakes in front of other people. The physical reaction was so strong that her hands sometimes shook under the desk, even though nobody else could see it. Her experience taught me an important lesson about language learning, because I realized that many students are not fighting English itself. They are fighting the fear associated with English. Before we can build communication skills, we must first understand what happens inside the body and mind when fear takes control. When people become nervous, the brain often interprets the situation as a threat even when no real danger exists. The heart beats faster, breathing becomes shorter, muscles become tense, and concentration becomes more difficult because the body is preparing itself for action. In everyday life, this response can be useful, but during a conversation, it often creates the opposite effect of what we want. A learner may know exactly what to say, yet suddenly experience a blank mind that seems to erase every sentence they practiced at home. This moment can feel frustrating because it creates the illusion that all previous study was wasted. The truth is very different because the knowledge is still there, but anxiety temporarily blocks access to it. Understanding this process is powerful because it allows us to stop blaming ourselves and start working with the mind more effectively. One of the most common mistakes learners make is believing that they must reach perfection before they begin speaking. They tell themselves that they will speak after they master grammar, after they memorize more vocabulary, or after they improve their pronunciation. Unfortunately, that perfect future moment never arrives because language learning is a continuous process rather than a final destination. Every fluent speaker continues learning new expressions, new vocabulary, and new ways to communicate more effectively. If perfection becomes the requirement for speaking, then speaking becomes impossible. I often ask my students a simple question, and that question is, did you wait until you were perfect before speaking your first language? The answer is always no, because communication grows through practice, mistakes, correction, and experience. The idea of making mistakes can feel uncomfortable, especially for adults who are accustomed to performing tasks competently in other areas of life. A professional engineer, business owner, nurse, or manager may feel confident at work, but suddenly feel vulnerable when speaking a foreign language. This emotional contrast creates additional pressure because people begin judging themselves more harshly than anyone else does. I have watched students apologize repeatedly for tiny grammar mistakes that did not affect understanding in any meaningful way. Meanwhile, the listener remained completely relaxed and focused on the message rather than the error. This reveals a reality that many learners overlook because most listeners are not searching for mistakes. They are simply trying to understand what you mean and connect with you as a person. One afternoon, I was speaking with an international visitor who spoke English with noticeable grammatical errors, yet our conversation flowed naturally and comfortably. We discussed food, travel, family traditions, and our favorite places to visit, and throughout the conversation, I remained interested in his stories rather than his language imperfections. Later, I reflected on that interaction because it perfectly demonstrated the true purpose of communication. Human beings generally value meaning more than perfection, especially in everyday conversations. When someone says, "I go beach yesterday," most listeners immediately understand the intended message despite the grammatical mistake. Communication succeeds because understanding occurs, and understanding is ultimately the goal that matters most. This realization leads to a powerful mindset shift that I encourage every learner to adopt. Instead of asking yourself, "What if I make a mistake?" begin asking, "What if I successfully share my idea?" The first question directs attention toward fear, while the second directs attention toward connection and possibility. Our minds tend to move toward whatever we focus on repeatedly, which means our internal dialogue can either strengthen confidence or strengthen anxiety. When learners constantly imagine failure, they unintentionally train themselves to expect failure. When they imagine successful communication, they gradually build a more supportive mental environment. Confidence does not appear magically from nowhere, but it grows through repeated experiences of speaking despite uncertainty. Another valuable habit involves paying attention to the body before focusing on the language. Many students try to force words out while remaining physically tense, which makes communication feel much harder than necessary. Before speaking, take a slow breath and allow your shoulders to relax naturally. Notice the tension in your neck, jaw, or hands and consciously release it if possible. Then place a gentle smile on your face, not because you must pretend to be happy, but because a relaxed expression often sends calming signals back to the brain. This simple routine may seem small, yet many learners discover that their thoughts become clearer when their bodies become calmer. A calm body creates a better environment for a confident voice. I sometimes ask students to practice a brief imaginary conversation while sitting comfortably and breathing slowly. They close their eyes and imagine meeting a friendly person who asks a simple question such as, "What is your name?" Instead of rushing, they answer calmly and naturally, allowing themselves time to think. Then they imagine hearing another question and responding with the same relaxed attitude. This exercise helps retrain the mind because it associates English with safety rather than danger. Over time, repeated positive experiences begin replacing old fears with new expectations. The goal is not to eliminate nervousness completely, because some nervousness is normal, but to prevent nervousness from controlling your actions. As we reach the end of today's lesson, I want you to remember one idea above all others, and that idea is that speaking imperfectly is completely okay. Every conversation is an opportunity to practice, learn, connect, and grow, and every mistake can become useful feedback rather than evidence of failure. The listener usually wants to understand you, not judge you, and your value as a communicator is not determined by flawless grammar. When you learn to calm your body, soften your self-criticism, and accept imperfection as a natural part of progress, you create the foundation upon which all future speaking skills can be built. In our next lesson, we will take the next logical step together by exploring the first building blocks of speech itself, learning how simple vocabulary and practical sentence structures can help you introduce yourself confidently and begin expressing your ideas with clarity. As I finished the previous lesson and reflected on everything we had discussed about fear, anxiety, and the courage to speak imperfectly, I thought about one of the most important discoveries I have made during my years as an English teacher in America. Once you accept that mistakes are normal and that communication matters more than perfection, a new question naturally appears in front of you. This lesson is designed to answer that question by showing you that the strongest foundation of spoken English is not complexity, but simplicity. I remember meeting a student named Carlos during a language workshop in Seattle several years ago. He had spent countless hours studying advanced grammar books and collecting sophisticated vocabulary, yet whenever he entered a real conversation, he became nervous and silent. One afternoon, I asked him to introduce himself to a visitor from another country, and instead of speaking naturally, he began searching his memory for impressive expressions. His eyes moved toward the ceiling, his breathing became tense, and after several uncomfortable seconds, he finally gave up and said that he did not know what to say. That experience reminded me of something I often see among language learners. People tend to imagine that successful English speakers are constantly using complicated vocabulary, but if you listen carefully to everyday conversations in the United States, you will notice something very different. Most daily interactions are built from simple words and simple structures. People introduce themselves, talk about their jobs, describe their plans, share opinions, and discuss their daily lives using language that is direct and easy to understand. The real power of communication comes from clarity, not from complexity. A simple sentence, spoken confidently, will almost always be more effective than a complicated sentence, spoken with hesitation and fear. Their minds become busy monitoring grammar, searching for rare vocabulary, and worrying about pronunciation at the same time. I have seen students freeze completely because they wanted to say something impressive when a much simpler sentence would have worked perfectly. Language learning becomes far more enjoyable when you give yourself permission to use the English you already know instead of constantly focusing on the English you have not learned yet. The goal is not to sound like a dictionary. The goal is to express yourself in a way that another human being can understand. For that reason, I always encourage beginners to focus on 4 pieces of information when introducing themselves. These 4 pieces are your name, where you are from, what you do, and why you're learning English. Together, they create a small but powerful framework that allows you to begin countless conversations. Imagine meeting someone for the first time and saying, "Hi, my name is Linda. I'm from Seattle. I'm an English teacher. I love helping people communicate." Notice how simple those sentences are. None of them contain advanced grammar, yet they immediately provide useful information and create opportunities for further conversation. The first element is your name, And although it sounds obvious, many learners overcomplicate this step. Sometimes students try to prepare elaborate introductions before mastering the simplest one. The expression, "my name is," sounds slightly more formal, while "I'm" feels more conversational and relaxed. Both are correct, both are useful, and both are used by native speakers every day. The important thing is not choosing the perfect version, but becoming comfortable saying it naturally and confidently whenever you meet someone new. The second element is where you are from. This part allows people to connect your story to a place and often opens the door to interesting conversations. You might say, "I'm from Vietnam," or "I'm from Brazil," or "I'm from South Korea." These simple structures appear constantly in everyday English because people are naturally curious about one another's backgrounds. A simple sentence can therefore become the beginning of a meaningful exchange of ideas, experiences, and cultural perspectives. The third element is your occupation or daily role in life. Many learners assume they need specialized vocabulary to describe themselves, but simple language is usually enough. A person can say, "I'm a student," "I'm a driver," "I work in a hospital," or "I work in a store." Even if your job title is complex, you can often explain it using easier words. The purpose of an introduction is not to demonstrate professional expertise. The purpose is to help another person understand who you are. The fourth element is perhaps my favorite because it reveals motivation and personality. This is the part where you explain why you are learning English. A learner might say, "I'm learning English for work," or "I'm learning English because I want to travel," or "I'm learning English because I enjoy meeting people from different countries." These sentences are simple, yet they tell a story. They reveal goals, dreams, and personal interests. People often respond warmly when they hear the reason behind someone's efforts because motivation is something that almost everyone can understand and appreciate. At first, they see only limitations, but once they connect a few simple sentences together, a complete introduction begins to emerge. The result may not sound perfect, but it sounds real, and that is what truly matters. The next challenge is learning how to speak without depending on a script, and for that we will need practical tools that allow us to train confidently on our own before stepping into real conversations. As I concluded our previous lesson, I invited you to think about a very important question. If you already know how to introduce yourself using simple and clear English, how do you transform those carefully prepared sentences into something that feels natural and automatic? During my years teaching English in America, I discovered that many learners become trapped in an unusual situation. They know exactly what they want to say when they are alone, yet when they suddenly face another person, their confidence disappears and the sentences seem to hide somewhere inside their minds. This happens because knowledge and reflex are not the same thing. Knowing a sentence is valuable, but being able to produce it naturally under pressure requires a different type of training. And today I want to share the tools that helped countless students build that bridge between preparation and real communication. I often compare language learning to learning a musical instrument because both require more than intellectual understanding. A person can read books about playing the piano and memorize the names of every key, yet none of that information automatically creates the ability to perform a beautiful song. The fingers must practice repeatedly until movement becomes natural and effortless. English speaking follows a similar pattern because the mouth, ears, brain, and emotions must learn to work together. Many students mistakenly believe that additional study is always the solution when they struggle to speak, but often what they truly need is structured practice that transforms knowledge into habit. The first method I want to discuss is something that initially feels strange to many learners, yet it remains one of the most powerful tools I have ever recommended. That tool is practicing in front of a mirror. The first time I suggested this exercise to a student, she laughed and asked whether I expected her to become friends with her own reflection. I smiled and told her that the mirror was not there to create vanity, but awareness. Most people never see their facial expressions, posture, or body language while speaking. They focus entirely on words while remaining unaware of the nonverbal signals they send to the world. The mirror changes this by allowing you to observe yourself from the perspective of another person. Whenever she practiced English in class, her voice became quiet and her eyes dropped toward the floor. At first, she felt uncomfortable, but after a few minutes, she began noticing things she had never realized before. Her shoulders were tense, her expression appeared worried, and she rarely smiled even when discussing topics she enjoyed. By observing these habits directly, she gained the ability to change them. When practicing with a mirror, I encourage learners to begin with the same simple self-introduction we developed previously. You might say, "Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm from Vietnam. I work in finance." As you speak, pay attention not only to the words but also to your posture, eye contact, and facial expression. Notice whether your body appears calm or tense. The mirror provides immediate feedback that no textbook can offer. Over time, this awareness helps create a more confident presence that supports your spoken communication rather than undermining it. I completely understand this reaction because even native speakers often feel uncomfortable when listening to recordings of themselves. Nevertheless, this temporary discomfort contains tremendous educational value. Recording yourself creates an opportunity to become both the speaker and the listener. It allows you to step outside your own perspective and evaluate your speech more objectively. Whenever I listened to those recordings, I discovered habits that I never noticed while speaking. Sometimes I spoke too quickly. Sometimes I repeated certain expressions unnecessarily. Occasionally, I rushed through important ideas because I felt nervous. These discoveries were not reasons for embarrassment. They were opportunities for improvement. Afterward, listen carefully and ask simple questions. Did you pause naturally between ideas? Did you pronounce familiar words confidently? Was your voice energetic or hesitant? You do not need to criticize every mistake because perfection is not the objective. Instead, focus on gradual improvement. One of my students developed an inspiring habit of saving every recording she made throughout an entire year. At first, her speech contained long pauses and noticeable hesitation. She frequently stopped to search for vocabulary and often restarted sentences before finishing them. The most remarkable part was that she did not notice the transformation day by day. Only when she compared older recordings with newer ones did she realize how far she had come. The third practice tool is known as shadowing, and it remains one of my favorite methods for improving speaking fluency. Shadowing involves listening to a native or highly proficient speaker and repeating what they say immediately afterward. The purpose is not simply copying words. The purpose is absorbing rhythm, pronunciation, intonation, and natural speech patterns. It is also music. When I first introduced shadowing to a group of adult learners, several students assumed it would be too difficult. They worried that native speakers talked too quickly and used unfamiliar expressions. One student listened to a recording that said, "It's nice to meet you," and immediately repeated it. Then she listened to another sentence and repeated that as well. Day after day, she continued this simple exercise. Gradually, her pronunciation improved, her confidence increased, and speaking began to feel less like translation and more like direct communication. What makes shadowing particularly powerful is that it trains multiple skills simultaneously. The ears learn to recognize sounds more accurately. The brain begins connecting meaning with expression at greater speed. Instead of analyzing every grammatical detail consciously, learners start developing intuitive familiarity with common patterns. This process resembles the way musicians learn rhythm by playing alongside experienced performers. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort creates confidence. As I reflect on everything we explored today, I want you to remember that confidence is rarely built through study alone. Confidence grows when preparation meets repeated action. Recording teaches self-evaluation. Shadowing teaches natural rhythm and pronunciation. Together, these tools create a personal training system that can be used almost anywhere without requiring a classroom or a conversation partner. Most importantly, they help transform prepared sentences into reliable reflexes that remain available even when nervousness appears. In our previous lesson, we focused on constructing simple introductions. Today, we learned how to practice those introductions until they become familiar and comfortable. Even if you can introduce yourself confidently, many learners continue translating every thought from their native language into English before speaking. This habit slows communication and creates hesitation. In the next chapter of our journey, I will share a powerful technique that helps break this pattern by teaching your mind to think directly in English through everyday observations and simple daily experiences. That shift will bring us one step closer to genuine fluency and a far more natural relationship with the language we are learning together. As I ended our previous lesson, I asked you to think about a challenge that affects almost every English learner at some point in their journey. Even after developing confidence, practicing with mirrors, recording your voice, and using shadowing exercises, there is still an invisible barrier that often prevents speech from flowing naturally. During my years as an English teacher in the United States, I noticed that many students shared the same frustration. They knew vocabulary, they understood grammar, and they could even build complete sentences, yet conversations still felt slow and exhausting. The reason was surprisingly simple. Before speaking English, they were first speaking their native language inside their minds, then translating those thoughts into English, and only after that process did they finally open their mouths. Today, I want to help you begin breaking that habit and developing a more direct relationship with the language. I often compare translation dependence to driving a car with the parking brake still engaged. The vehicle can move, but every movement requires more effort than necessary. Many learners spend years unknowingly carrying this extra mental weight. They hear a question in English, mentally convert it into their native language, think of an answer, translate that answer back into English, and then finally speak. This process may happen quickly, but it still creates delays that interfere with natural communication. The result is hesitation, uncertainty, and a feeling that conversations move faster than the learner can manage. What many people mistake for a lack of fluency is often simply the burden of constant internal translation. I remember one student named Elena who experienced this problem very clearly. She was intelligent, hardworking, and highly motivated, yet she often became frustrated during conversations. One afternoon after class, she explained her experience to me in a way I never forgot. She said that speaking English felt like carrying two dictionaries in her head at the same time. Every sentence required a journey from one language to another before it could be expressed. By the time she finished translating her thoughts, the conversation had already moved forward. The good news is that the human brain is remarkably adaptable. Just as we trained confidence through repeated exposure and built speaking habits through consistent practice, we can also train ourselves to think more directly in English. This transformation does not happen overnight, and it certainly does not require abandoning your native language. Instead, it begins with small daily exercises that gradually teach your mind to associate English words directly with real experiences. Over time, these direct connections become stronger, and the need for translation becomes weaker. The process is gentle, natural, and surprisingly enjoyable when approached correctly. One of the easiest ways to begin is by describing simple actions that occur throughout your day. These descriptions do not need to be complicated. In fact, simplicity is one of the most important elements of this exercise. Imagine waking up in the morning and noticing that you are brushing your teeth. Instead of silently thinking about the action in your native language, try saying to yourself in English, "I am brushing my teeth." The sentence is simple, but something powerful is happening. Your brain is connecting the action directly to English without requiring an intermediate translation step. As the day continues, opportunities for practice appear everywhere. While preparing breakfast, you might think, "I am making coffee," or "I am cooking eggs." When looking through a window, you might observe, "The sky is blue," or "It is raining today." These sentences are not impressive, and they are not meant to be. Their purpose is not to demonstrate advanced English. Their purpose is to build direct pathways between experience and language. Every time you create one of these connections, you strengthen a mental habit that supports future fluency. I remember experimenting with a similar technique while studying a foreign language during my university years. At first, I constantly translated every thought because that felt natural and familiar. However, one day I challenged myself to spend an afternoon mentally describing my surroundings using only the language I was learning. As I walked across campus, I quietly observed things around me. I thought, "The trees are tall, the students are talking, and the weather is nice today." The sentences were simple, yet after a few weeks I noticed something remarkable. I began producing those thoughts automatically, without consciously deciding to translate them. Many learners mistakenly believe that fluency develops through dramatic breakthroughs, but in reality it is often built through countless small moments. Every time you describe an ordinary activity in English, you're performing a tiny exercise that contributes to a much larger transformation. While washing dishes, you might think, "The water is warm." While walking through a park, you might observe, "There are many people here." While drinking tea, you might simply say, "This tea tastes good." These brief moments may seem insignificant individually, but together they gradually reshape the way your brain interacts with English. Another advantage of this method is that it removes the pressure associated with public speaking. When practicing internally, there is no audience, no judgment, and no fear of mistakes. The mind becomes a private training ground where experimentation feels safe. This freedom encourages consistency because learners are more willing to practice when the experience feels comfortable rather than stressful. Over time, the brain becomes accustomed to hearing English thoughts throughout the day. What once felt artificial slowly begins to feel normal. I often encourage students to focus on observation rather than perfection during this stage. If you forget a word, do not panic. Instead, use simpler vocabulary that communicates the same idea. Suppose you want to describe a complicated object, but do not know the exact term. Rather than stopping completely, describe what you can see. Communication is not about demonstrating linguistic perfection. It is about expressing meaning. By prioritizing expression over accuracy, you keep the flow of thought moving forward and reinforce the habit of thinking directly in English. There is also an important psychological benefit hidden within this practice. When learners constantly translate, they often feel as though English exists outside their identity, like a separate tool that must be accessed whenever necessary. Direct thinking gradually changes this relationship. English begins to feel less like a subject being studied and more like a natural extension of daily experience. The language becomes woven into ordinary life rather than confined to classrooms, textbooks, and formal study sessions. This shift creates a sense of familiarity that supports long-term confidence. One student once told me that after several months of practicing daily observation in English, she experienced a surprising moment while shopping. She noticed an item on a shelf and immediately thought, "That looks interesting," without translating the idea from her native language first. The thought appeared naturally and spontaneously. She became so excited by the experience that she called it her first true moment of fluency. Although she still had much to learn, that small event represented an important milestone because it showed her that direct thinking was becoming possible. As these mental habits become stronger, speaking begins to change as well. Responses emerge more quickly because fewer translation steps are involved. Conversations feel smoother because ideas travel a shorter path from thought to speech. Instead of carrying the burden of constant conversion between languages, they begin expressing themselves more naturally. The process is not perfect, and occasional translation remains normal, but the overall flow becomes faster and more comfortable. When I think about all the students I've taught throughout my career, the ones who achieved the greatest improvements were rarely the ones who memorized the most grammar rules. They transformed routine activities into opportunities for practice. They described their surroundings, observed their actions, and gradually trained their minds to operate more directly in English. Through consistency, they developed reflexes that could support real communication. As we conclude today's lesson, I want you to remember that thinking in English is not a mysterious talent possessed by a lucky few. Every time you describe a small action, observe your environment, or narrate a routine task in English, you are helping your brain become more comfortable with a new flow of thought. These small exercises accumulate over time, creating faster reflexes and stronger confidence. In our next lesson, we will take the natural next step in this journey, because once your thoughts begin flowing more freely in English, you will be ready to step outside your inner world and learn how to initiate real conversations with other people through simple, effective conversation starters that open the door to meaningful human connection. As I finished our previous lesson about thinking directly in English, I invited you to imagine a future version of yourself moving through daily life with greater ease and confidence. By learning to describe your actions, observe your surroundings, and create direct connections between experience and language, you have already taken a significant step toward fluency. Yet another challenge now stands before us, and in many ways it is one of the most intimidating moments in the entire communication process. Throughout my years teaching in the United States, I have watched countless students successfully answer questions, participate in discussions, and share ideas once a conversation had already started. However, asking the very first question or speaking the very first sentence often felt far more frightening than anything that followed. I understand this fear deeply because the beginning of a conversation contains a certain amount of uncertainty. Before speaking, we do not know how the other person will respond. We do not know whether they will be friendly, interested, distracted, or busy. The mind naturally creates countless possibilities, many of which are far more negative than reality. I have seen students spend several minutes mentally preparing a greeting, only to lose courage at the final moment and remain silent. Later they often tell me that they felt foolish for worrying, because the situation turned out to be much easier than they expected. This pattern reveals an important truth about communication. Very often the anticipation of speaking creates more anxiety than the conversation itself. One afternoon in Seattle, I was sitting in a small coffee shop grading assignments when I noticed a student from one of my evening classes enter the cafe. She saw another English speaker sitting alone nearby and clearly wanted to practice her conversation skills. Eventually, she gathered enough courage to walk over and simply say, "Hi, how are you today?" The other person smiled warmly and replied, "I'm doing well, thanks. How about you?" What followed was a relaxed and enjoyable conversation that lasted nearly 20 minutes. The remarkable thing was that the entire interaction began with a greeting that contained only a few simple words. That experience reinforced something I often teach my students. It does not require advanced vocabulary, perfect pronunciation, or fascinating stories. In most situations, it simply requires opening a small door. Many learners mistakenly believe they must impress people from the very first sentence. In reality, most conversations begin with language that is surprisingly simple. Expressions such as hello, good morning, how are you, and nice to meet you continue to be used every day because they perform an important social function. They create connection before information. Greetings may appear basic, but they possess tremendous power. When used sincerely, they communicate friendliness, openness, and respect. In American culture, greetings often serve as social bridges between strangers. A cashier may ask, "How's your day going?" A coworker may begin with, "How was your weekend?" These exchanges are not always attempts to gather detailed information. Understanding this purpose helps learners realize that greetings are not tests. They are invitations. Instead of forcing yourself to carry an entire conversation alone, you create an opportunity for the other person to participate. Consider the difference between preparing a long speech and asking a simple question. A speech requires continuous effort from one speaker, while a question immediately invites collaboration. This is why I often encourage learners to rely on what I call door-opening questions. More importantly, they shift part of the conversational responsibility to the other person, making the interaction feel more balanced. Notice how much possibility exists within that simple question. The other person might say yes and explain why they decided to attend. They might say no and share previous experiences. Suddenly, the conversation begins moving naturally without requiring you to carry every detail yourself. The question acts like a spark that starts the engine of communication. Its strength comes not from complexity, but from its ability to invite participation. Another useful example is the question, "How was your day?" This expression appears frequently in everyday English because it allows people to share experiences, emotions, and stories at whatever level feels comfortable. One person may simply answer, "It was good, thank you." Another may describe a challenging project at work, an enjoyable family activity, or an unexpected adventure. The beauty of the question lies in its flexibility. It creates space for conversation while remaining easy to understand and easy to ask. For learners, this simplicity makes it an excellent tool for building confidence. When you know several reliable ways to begin a conversation, you no longer face the frightening question of what to say first. Instead, you can focus your attention on the person in front of you. When you ask a sincere question, you provide an opportunity for the other person to share something meaningful. This creates a natural exchange in which both participants contribute. Many anxious learners believe they must constantly produce interesting ideas to keep a conversation alive. In reality, thoughtful questions often do more work than long explanations. A good question demonstrates curiosity, and curiosity is one of the foundations of meaningful communication. I remember another student who struggled with conversation because she believed she needed to sound impressive. Every interaction felt like a performance, and the pressure exhausted her. Instead of worrying about what she would say next, she concentrated on learning about other people. The results surprised her. Conversations became easier, longer, and more enjoyable. By directing attention outward rather than inward, she reduced self-consciousness and created stronger connections with others. As your confidence grows, you may notice that these simple openings begin leading to unexpected opportunities. A brief greeting can become a discussion about travel. A question about someone's day can become a conversation about careers, hobbies, or family traditions. Communication often develops organically when given a chance. The important thing is not predicting where the conversation will go. Every meaningful friendship, professional relationship, and memorable conversation starts with a first sentence spoken by someone willing to take that small risk. Another lesson I have learned from years of teaching is that successful communicators are not necessarily the people who talk the most. A warm greeting, a genuine smile, and a thoughtful question can accomplish far more than an elaborate introduction. These simple actions communicate respect and interest, two qualities that people appreciate across cultures and languages. As we reach the end of today's lesson, I want you to remember that starting a conversation is rarely about finding the perfect words. It is about creating an opportunity for human connection. A greeting opens the door. Once that exchange begins, communication becomes a shared experience rather than a solitary performance. This realization can transform speaking from a source of anxiety into an opportunity for discovery. Yet every experienced communicator knows that starting a conversation is only the beginning. That skill is not speaking more, speaking faster, or using more advanced vocabulary. The skill is listening. In our next lesson, I will show you why listening is often more important than speaking, how it reduces conversational pressure, and how it allows genuine communication to flourish in ways that many learners never expect. As I concluded our previous lesson, I emphasized that a successful conversation does not begin with perfect grammar or extraordinary vocabulary. It begins with a simple act of courage, the willingness to open a door and invite another person into a shared moment of communication. Yet once that first spark has been lit, another challenge immediately appears. During my years teaching English in the United States, however, I discovered a surprising truth. They were the ones who learned how to listen. At first, this idea may sound strange because most people associate language learning with speaking. Without listening, communication becomes little more than two separate monologues competing for space. Understanding this reality changed the way I approached both teaching and learning languages. I remember a student named Daniel who constantly worried about making mistakes. While someone was sharing a story, he was mentally searching for vocabulary. While someone was asking a question, he was already constructing an answer. On the surface, this behavior appeared productive because he seemed focused on speaking accurately. In reality, however, he was missing large portions of the conversation. One afternoon, I observed Daniel during a speaking activity with another student. When it was Daniel's turn to respond, he completely ignored most of what had been said and delivered a prepared answer about his own hobbies. The response was grammatically correct, but it felt disconnected because it did not acknowledge the conversation that had just occurred. Later, when we discussed the exercise, Daniel admitted that he had barely listened because he was too busy worrying about his own performance. His experience revealed a common problem that affects countless language learners around the world. Anxious speakers often believe that success depends entirely on what they say next. As a result, they devote so much mental energy to planning future responses that they stop paying attention to the present moment. Ironically, this habit makes communication more difficult rather than easier. When you truly listen, the other person provides valuable information that can help you respond naturally. Their words offer topics, ideas, emotions, and questions that can guide the conversation forward. Listening reduces pressure because it reminds you that you are not responsible for creating the entire interaction alone. I often encourage my students to imagine that listening is like gathering pieces of a puzzle. You do not need to understand every single word in order to understand the larger picture. Instead, focus on key words, important phrases, and the general meaning being communicated. These key pieces provide enough information to continue the conversation naturally. For example, after hearing that statement, you might respond by asking, "Did you enjoy the museums?" Or, "Was it your first time in Chicago?" Notice that neither question requires perfect comprehension. Both questions emerge from attentive listening rather than elaborate preparation. The goal is not to analyze every grammatical structure in real time. The goal is to understand enough to remain connected to the conversation. When learners realize this, much of their anxiety begins to fade because they no longer feel obligated to process every detail perfectly. Listening also creates emotional benefits that many people overlook. Human beings naturally appreciate attentive listeners because being understood feels rewarding. Throughout my teaching career, I have noticed that students who develop strong listening habits often become more popular conversation partners despite having limited vocabulary. People enjoy speaking with them because they ask thoughtful questions, remember details, and show sincere interest in what others are saying. These qualities create stronger impressions than linguistic perfection alone. Another important lesson involves learning to accept silence. Many learners view silence as evidence of failure. Their hearts begin racing, and they desperately search for words to fill the empty space. Silence is not necessarily a sign of weakness. Often it is a sign that communication is unfolding naturally. I remember attending a dinner gathering with several friends many years ago. Nobody appeared uncomfortable. No one rushed to fill the silence immediately. After a short pause, someone introduced a new topic and the discussion continued naturally. The experience reminded me that silence only becomes frightening when we decide to interpret it as a problem. In many situations, it is simply another part of communication, as normal as speaking itself. One of my students once confessed that she feared silence more than grammar mistakes. This pressure exhausted her and made every interaction feel stressful. I encouraged her to experiment with a different mindset. Instead of viewing silence as an emergency, she began treating it as a moment of reflection. If a pause occurred, she allowed it to exist for a few seconds without panic. Gradually, she discovered that conversations did not collapse. In fact, many became more comfortable because she no longer forced herself to speak constantly. Accepting silence also improves listening because it creates space for deeper understanding. When you are not rushing to respond, you can pay greater attention to what has already been said. You can notice emotions, intentions, and subtle meanings that might otherwise be overlooked. This shift transforms the entire experience of speaking English. As learners become more comfortable with listening, they often notice another unexpected change. Their responses become more natural. Rather than delivering memorized speeches, they begin reacting to real information in real time. Questions arise organically. Comments feel more relevant. The rhythm of conversation develops greater balance. Whenever I think about the most memorable conversations in my life, I rarely remember the people who used the most advanced vocabulary. Instead, I remember the people who listened carefully and made me feel understood. They asked thoughtful questions. They responded to details I shared. They demonstrated curiosity and attention. These qualities transformed ordinary conversations into meaningful experiences. Language serves as the vehicle, but listening provides the direction. The beautiful thing about listening is that it is available to learners at every level. These abilities create opportunities for connection long before fluency arrives. In many cases, they actually accelerate fluency because they keep conversations moving and provide more opportunities for meaningful interaction. Speaking matters, but listening matters just as much. By listening for keywords, responding naturally, and accepting occasional silence as a normal part of human interaction, you create a steady rhythm that supports genuine communication. In our next lesson, we will explore how talking about the things you genuinely love can fill your voice with energy, confidence, and enthusiasm, drawing listeners naturally into your world and making conversations feel more alive than ever before. As I finished our previous lesson about listening, I asked you to consider something that many language learners never fully appreciate. Communication becomes easier when we stop treating it as a performance and begin treating it as a genuine exchange between human beings. We learned that listening carefully, responding naturally, and accepting short moments of silence can transform conversations from stressful experiences into meaningful connections. Yet once you have developed the ability to listen well and maintain the rhythm of a conversation, another opportunity appears before you. The question is no longer how to start a conversation or how to keep it alive. The question becomes how to bring energy, personality, and authenticity into that conversation. During my years as an English teacher in the United States, I discovered that one of the most effective ways to accomplish this is by talking about something you genuinely love. I have met students from every imaginable background. Some were passionate about football, while others loved music, photography, cooking, hiking, technology, gardening, books, travel, or art. Interestingly, I often noticed a dramatic change whenever learners shifted from discussing a random topic to discussing a personal passion. Their posture improved, their eyes became brighter, and their voices suddenly carried more energy. Students who had previously struggled to produce complete sentences somehow found themselves speaking longer and more naturally. Their grammar was not suddenly perfect, and their vocabulary was not magically transformed overnight. What changed was their emotional connection to the topic. Passion supplied energy, and energy made communication feel more alive. I remember a student named Marco, who constantly described himself as a poor English speaker. During classroom discussions, he often answered questions with short and hesitant responses. He worried about making mistakes and frequently apologized for errors that most people barely noticed. One day, I asked the class to talk about something they enjoyed doing during their free time. Marco hesitated at first, but when he mentioned football, everything changed. Within minutes, he was describing his favorite teams, memorable matches, famous players, and childhood experiences watching games with his family. The same student who previously struggled to speak suddenly became one of the most enthusiastic voices in the room. After class, I reflected on what had happened. Marco had not suddenly acquired new grammar knowledge. He had not memorized hundreds of additional vocabulary words during the lesson. The difference was that he cared deeply about the topic. His mind was focused on sharing ideas rather than avoiding mistakes. His excitement created momentum that carried the conversation forward. This experience taught me something I have never forgotten. Enthusiasm often accomplishes what perfection cannot. People are naturally drawn to energy, sincerity, and genuine interest. When someone speaks passionately about a subject they love, listeners rarely focus on small grammatical imperfections. Instead, they become interested in the story being told. Imagine two different speakers. One uses flawless grammar while discussing a topic they do not care about, speaking with little emotion or enthusiasm. The other makes occasional mistakes but speaks with genuine excitement about a favorite hobby. In many situations, the second speaker will be far more engaging because human beings respond to emotion as much as information. Communication is not merely the exchange of words. It is the exchange of energy, curiosity, and experience. One reason hobbies are so useful in language learning is that they provide an endless supply of conversation material. Consider someone who enjoys cooking. That person can discuss favorite recipes, cooking techniques, memorable meals, ingredients, family traditions, restaurants, and culinary goals. Each of these topics creates opportunities for meaningful conversation. The same principle applies to almost any hobby. A traveler can describe destinations, cultural experiences, transportation challenges, and future plans. A musician can discuss instruments, performances, favorite songs, and creative inspiration. A football fan can analyze matches, players, strategies, and unforgettable moments. As learners, we often underestimate how much knowledge we already possess within our areas of interest. We may believe that we lack the vocabulary necessary to discuss our hobbies, but in reality, we usually know far more than we realize. The challenge is organizing and expanding that vocabulary intentionally. This is why I encourage students to build personal vocabulary banks related to their passions. Instead of trying to memorize random words from unrelated topics, focus first on language that connects directly to your life. These words are easier to remember because they already possess personal meaning. I once worked with a student who loved photography. Together, we created a small collection of useful vocabulary connected to her hobby. She learned words such as camera, lens, lighting, portrait, landscape, focus, exposure, and composition. More importantly, she learned how to use these words in meaningful sentences. She practiced saying things like, "I enjoy taking landscape photographs," and "I usually take pictures during sunset because the lighting is beautiful." As her vocabulary expanded, so did her confidence. Conversations about photography became opportunities to express herself rather than sources of anxiety. The process of developing hobby-related vocabulary also strengthens motivation. Many learners become discouraged when studying language feels disconnected from their real lives. Memorizing lists of unfamiliar words without meaningful context can feel exhausting and repetitive. However, learning vocabulary connected to personal interests feels different. Each new word becomes a tool that helps you communicate something important about yourself. The learning process becomes more rewarding because the language serves a purpose that extends beyond passing tests or completing exercises. I often encourage students to imagine themselves attending an international gathering where people from different countries are sharing stories and experiences. In such situations, hobbies frequently become natural conversation topics because they reveal personality and create common ground. Someone might ask, "What do you enjoy doing in your free time?" Or, "What are your favorite hobbies?" These simple questions open doors to deeper discussions. When you have prepared vocabulary related to your interests, you can walk through those doors with greater confidence and ease. Another fascinating aspect of discussing hobbies is that enthusiasm tends to be contagious. When people hear genuine excitement in your voice, they often become curious about the subject even if they know very little about it. I have listened to passionate gardeners describe plants, enthusiastic travelers recount adventures, and dedicated musicians discuss instruments I had never played. What kept me interested was not always the topic itself. It was the speaker's energy. Their enthusiasm transformed ordinary information into engaging stories. This is a valuable lesson for language learners because it demonstrates that communication involves much more than technical accuracy. There is also an important psychological benefit to talking about things you love. Anxiety often decreases when attention shifts away from performance and toward personal expression. Instead of constantly asking yourself whether your grammar is correct, you begin focusing on sharing experiences, opinions, and memories that matter to you. This shift reduces self-consciousness and encourages greater fluency. The conversation becomes less about avoiding mistakes and more about connecting with another person. One of my favorite moments as a teacher occurs when students realize that they have been speaking for several minutes without obsessing over every word. These moments usually happen while discussing topics they genuinely care about. Time seems to move differently because their attention is fully engaged. They become storytellers rather than language learners. They stop viewing English as an obstacle and start using it as a bridge. This transformation represents an important milestone in the journey toward confident communication. As your collection of hobby-related vocabulary grows, you will begin noticing opportunities to use it in real conversations. A discussion about sports may lead naturally to your interest in football. A conversation about travel may connect to a memorable trip you once took. A discussion about food may provide an opportunity to describe your favorite recipe. Each interaction strengthens both your vocabulary and your confidence. Over time, these experiences create a solid foundation for broader communication across many different situations. The beautiful thing about hobbies is that they belong uniquely to you. No one else has exactly the same experiences, preferences, memories, and passions that you possess. When you share these aspects of your life, you bring authenticity into the conversation. Authenticity is powerful because it creates genuine human connection. People are often more interested in hearing a sincere story than listening to a perfectly structured sentence. Your personal interests provide an endless source of stories waiting to be told. As we reach the end of today's lesson, I want you to remember that enthusiasm is one of the most valuable communication tools you possess. When you talk about topics you genuinely love, your voice becomes more energetic, your ideas flow more naturally, and your confidence increases. Small grammatical mistakes lose much of their power because listeners become focused on your message rather than your imperfections. By building vocabulary connected to your hobbies and passions, you create a personal bank of language that belongs to you and reflects your unique identity. In our next lesson, we will take that growing confidence and vocabulary into a variety of real-world situations, exploring how these skills can help you navigate everyday interactions such as shopping, ordering food, asking for directions, and handling the unexpected moments that appear throughout daily life. We discovered that enthusiasm has a remarkable ability to make speech flow more naturally, allowing personality to shine through even when grammar is not perfect. We also learned that developing vocabulary connected to your hobbies creates a personal reservoir of language that can support meaningful conversations. Life constantly places us in practical situations that require us to use English for real purposes. Today, I want to guide you into those real-world environments because confidence grows strongest when language becomes a tool for everyday living rather than a subject that exists only inside books and classrooms. Throughout my years teaching English in the United States, I noticed that many learners felt comfortable discussing familiar topics during lessons, but became nervous when facing ordinary situations outside the classroom. Ordering a drink, asking for directions, making a purchase, or requesting information suddenly felt much more intimidating. The reason was not necessarily a lack of vocabulary. More often, it was the unpredictability of real interaction. In a textbook exercise, the conversation usually follows a predictable path. In real life, however, people respond in unexpected ways, ask surprising questions, and speak with different accents, speeds, and personalities. Learning to navigate this uncertainty is an important step toward genuine communication. I remember a student who spent months studying grammar and pronunciation before traveling abroad. She felt prepared until she entered a small cafe and attempted to order a drink. The employee smiled and asked a simple follow-up question that she had never practiced. Although she understood most of the words, the unexpected nature of the question caused her confidence to disappear temporarily. Later she told me that the experience taught her an important lesson. Fluency is not simply knowing English. Fluency also involves adapting when conversations do not unfold exactly as expected. That flexibility becomes easier when we prepare for common situations in advance. One of the most useful environments for practice is a cafe because it combines simple vocabulary with practical communication. Imagine walking into a quiet coffee shop and approaching the counter. You might begin with a polite greeting such as, "Hello," followed by a straightforward request like, "I would like a cup of tea, please." In many situations, simple language accomplishes the task perfectly. Perhaps they want to know what size you prefer, whether you would like anything else, or whether you plan to stay or take your drink with you. This is where flexibility becomes important. Instead, focus on understanding keywords and responding calmly. One phrase I strongly recommend learning is, Excuse me, can you repeat that, please? Many learners feel embarrassed when they do not understand something immediately, but even native speakers occasionally ask others to repeat themselves. Background noise, unfamiliar accents, and momentary distractions affect everyone. It is a sign that you are actively participating in the conversation and making an effort to understand. Whether you are visiting a grocery store, a clothing shop, or a market while traveling, basic communication skills can make the experience much more enjoyable. Imagine picking up an item and wanting to know its cost. A simple question such as, "How much is this?" The sentence is short, practical, and widely understood. Because it serves a clear purpose, it becomes easy to remember and use repeatedly. Shopping situations also offer opportunities to practice listening. Instead of worrying about every individual word, focus on the overall message. Remember what we learned in our lesson about listening. Your job is not to understand every syllable perfectly. Your job is to remain engaged, listen for key information, and respond as naturally as possible. Whenever I visit a new city, I am reminded of how valuable simple questions can be. Even native speakers occasionally need directions when exploring unfamiliar places. Imagine standing on a busy street and wanting to locate a train station, a museum, or a restaurant. Followed by, "How do I get to the train station?" Creates an opportunity for useful interaction. Most people appreciate polite communication and are often willing to assist. This is another situation where flexibility matters. You may not understand every detail immediately. You can say, "Could you say that more slowly, please?" These requests demonstrate an important truth about communication. Success does not depend on never encountering difficulties. Success depends on knowing how to manage difficulties when they appear. Role-playing these situations at home can be surprisingly effective. I often encourage students to imagine themselves standing in a cafe, speaking with a cashier, shopping for groceries, or asking for directions in a new city. At first, practicing alone may feel unusual. The brain benefits from rehearsal because familiar experiences tend to produce less anxiety than unfamiliar ones. By practicing common interactions repeatedly, you reduce uncertainty and increase confidence. I once worked with a learner who transformed part of her living room into an imaginary cafe. She practiced ordering drinks, asking questions, and responding to common situations several times each week. Months later, when she traveled abroad, she discovered that many real interactions felt surprisingly familiar. This is one of the greatest advantages of role-play. Many learners mistakenly believe that sounding fluent means speaking rapidly. In reality, speaking too quickly often increases mistakes and reduces clarity. A calm, deliberate sentence is usually more effective than a rushed sentence filled with confusion. Native speakers frequently adjust their pace depending on the situation, and language learners should feel comfortable doing the same. I often remind students that communication is not a race. When nervousness appears, there can be a temptation to rush through sentences as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, this usually creates additional stress. Slowing down allows the mind to organize thoughts more effectively. It also gives listeners more time to understand you. Confidence often grows when you stop measuring success by speed and start measuring it by clarity and connection. As learners gain experience in real-world situations, they gradually develop resilience. They are simply part of communication. Sometimes you will understand everything immediately. All of these experiences are normal. Language learning is not about achieving perfection. It is about developing the ability to continue communicating even when circumstances are imperfect. Looking back on the journeys of many students I have taught, I notice a common pattern. The greatest growth often occurred when they stopped viewing English as an academic subject and started using it as a practical tool. Ordering food, shopping, traveling, asking questions, and solving everyday problems transformed language from theory into experience. Each interaction added another layer of confidence. As we reach the end of today's lesson, I want you to remember that real-world communication is built from simple actions performed consistently. Most importantly, allow yourself permission to learn through experience rather than demanding perfection from every interaction. As you move through these everyday situations, you will eventually discover something that every successful language learner encounters. The journey of learning English is not a straight line moving endlessly upward. In our next lesson, we will explore how to handle those emotional ups and downs, how to stay motivated when progress feels uneven, and how to continue moving forward even when confidence temporarily fades. As I concluded our previous lesson, I encouraged you to step beyond the safety of practice exercises and begin using English in the real world. We explored situations such as ordering drinks, shopping, asking for directions, and handling unexpected questions with calm flexibility. Those experiences revealed an important truth. Learning English is not simply about collecting vocabulary or mastering grammar rules. It is about gradually building confidence through action. Yet, after many years of teaching students from around the world, I have noticed that confidence itself is often misunderstood. Many learners imagine confidence as something that suddenly appears one day, as though a magical switch has been flipped inside the mind. In reality, confidence develops much more slowly, and understanding this process can make your entire language learning journey more enjoyable and sustainable. Whenever I think about confidence, I often picture a young tree growing in a garden. When a tree is first planted, its progress seems almost invisible. Yet beneath the surface, roots are spreading through the soil, becoming stronger and deeper. The most important improvements often occur before we can clearly see them. Each conversation, each listening exercise, each new phrase, and each small act of courage contributes to growth that gradually becomes stronger over time. One of the greatest obstacles to this process is comparison. While these resources can be inspiring, they can also create unrealistic expectations. I have met many students who watch highly proficient speakers online and immediately begin criticizing themselves. Instead of appreciating their own progress, they focus entirely on the distance between their current abilities and someone else's achievements. Every week, she would attend class feeling discouraged despite making steady progress. Whenever I asked why she seemed frustrated, she would mention videos of advanced speakers she had watched online. I asked whether she was better than she had been 6 months earlier. She paused for a moment and then smiled because she knew the answer was yes. That conversation became a turning point for her. Instead of measuring herself against strangers on the internet, she began comparing herself only to her previous self. The change was remarkable. She started noticing improvements that had previously gone unnoticed. She realized that she could understand videos more easily. She discovered that conversations felt less intimidating. None of these achievements made her instantly fluent, but they represented meaningful progress. This idea brings us to one of the most important habits a language learner can develop. Learn to celebrate small victories. However, small victories are the building blocks of long-term success. Imagine understanding a sentence in a video that would have confused you a month ago. Imagine recognizing a word you recently learned while listening to a podcast. Imagine successfully ordering food in English or asking someone a simple question. These experiences may appear minor, but each one represents evidence of growth. It is built through hundreds of small successes accumulated over time. Consider the courage required to say hello to a stranger. For a highly confident speaker, that action may seem ordinary. For someone struggling with anxiety, however, it can represent a significant personal victory. It should be measured by the challenge it represented for the individual experiencing it. One of my favorite memories involves a student who spent weeks preparing to speak with an English-speaking tourist visiting her city. She practiced greetings, reviewed common questions, and rehearsed possible responses repeatedly. From an outside perspective, the interaction seemed brief and unremarkable. Yet when she described the experience later, her excitement was unforgettable. There is a psychological reason why celebrating small victories matters so much. The human brain responds strongly to evidence of progress. When we acknowledge achievements, even modest ones, we reinforce positive associations with effort. Learning begins to feel rewarding rather than exhausting. Instead, success becomes something that can be experienced regularly through everyday growth. Unfortunately, many people wait until they reach fluency before allowing themselves to feel proud. They treat confidence as a reward that must be earned through perfection. This mindset creates an endless cycle because fluency itself is not a fixed destination. Even highly proficient speakers continue learning new expressions, refining pronunciation, and expanding vocabulary. A healthier approach is to appreciate progress while continuing to pursue improvement. Some days, everything seems easy. Words arrive quickly, listening feels effortless, and conversations flow naturally. These fluctuations are completely normal. Human performance varies due to energy levels, emotions, stress, sleep quality, and countless other factors. They are simply part of the process. Then, seemingly without warning, I would encounter moments where basic conversations suddenly felt challenging again. Over time, however, I realized that progress was still occurring despite temporary setbacks. Both were part of the same journey. Instead of panicking when performance declines temporarily, they recognize such moments as natural fluctuations rather than permanent problems. Rather than asking, "Why am I getting worse?" they begin asking, "What can I learn from this experience?" The shift may seem subtle, but it has a powerful impact on long-term consistency. Consistency ultimately matters more than intensity. A person who practices a little each day often achieves greater results than someone who studies intensely for short periods before quitting. The roots deepen long before the branches become impressive. Each small action contributes to future strength. None of these skills appeared instantly. The same principles apply to confidence itself. It develops through consistent action rather than dramatic transformation. As we reach the end of today's lesson, I want you to remember that patience is not passive. Patience is the decision to continue moving forward even when progress feels slow. Self-appreciation is not arrogance. It is the ability to recognize growth while remaining committed to improvement. Together, these qualities create a powerful mental foundation that can sustain long-term learning. In our final lesson, we will bring everything together and explore how to transform English from a temporary project into a lasting part of your lifestyle, ensuring that the habits, confidence, and communication skills you've built continue growing far into the future. As I concluded our previous lesson, I invited you to think about confidence not as a destination, but as a living process. We explored the importance of patience, the danger of comparison, and the value of celebrating small victories that often go unnoticed by others. Throughout this entire journey, we have gradually built a foundation that began with overcoming fear and evolved into practical communication skills that can be used in everyday life. We learned how to speak despite imperfection, how to introduce ourselves. Now, as we arrive at the final chapter of our shared journey, I want to focus on the one principle that quietly supports every other skill we have discussed. That principle is consistency. During my years as an English teacher in the United States, I have met students from every imaginable background. Some were teenagers preparing for future opportunities, while others were adults balancing careers, families, and personal responsibilities. Despite their differences, many arrived with the same belief. They assumed that dramatic progress required dramatic effort. They imagined long study sessions lasting several hours each day. They believed success depended on overwhelming intensity. While dedication certainly matters, experience has repeatedly shown me that sustainable growth is usually built through a different approach. Consistency often accomplishes more than intensity because consistency creates habits, and habits are what transform temporary effort into lasting change. I remember one student who studied English for 6 hours every Saturday and then avoided it completely during the rest of the week. Another student practiced for only 15 minutes each day. At first glance, the first learner appeared more committed because the total effort seemed larger and more impressive. Yet after several months, the second student demonstrated significantly greater improvement. Her daily practice kept English active in her mind. The language remained connected to her routine rather than existing as an occasional project. This experience reinforced a lesson I have observed countless times. Small actions repeated consistently often produce greater results than large actions performed irregularly. One reason consistency is so powerful involves the way the brain learns. Human memory strengthens through repeated exposure over time. When English becomes part of your daily experience, the language gradually begins feeling familiar rather than foreign. Vocabulary appears more frequently, sentence patterns become easier to recognize, and communication starts requiring less conscious effort. These changes do not occur because of a single extraordinary study session. They occur because the brain receives regular opportunities to practice, adapt, and grow. Every small encounter with the language contributes to this process. This is why I often encourage learners to abandon the idea that every study session must be long or difficult. If you have 10 or 15 minutes available, use them. Read a short article. Listen to a brief story. Review a few useful phrases. Practice speaking aloud for several minutes. These activities may seem modest individually, yet their cumulative effect can be remarkable. Progress is rarely determined by what happens during a single day. Progress is determined by what happens repeatedly across weeks, months, and years. Another valuable strategy involves surrounding yourself with English whenever possible. Many learners assume that meaningful practice only occurs during formal study sessions. However, some of the most effective learning opportunities exist within ordinary daily routines. Your environment influences your habits more than many people realize. By increasing your exposure to English, you create additional opportunities for learning without dramatically changing your schedule. Small environmental adjustments can produce surprisingly large results over time. One simple example is changing the language settings on your phone. I have recommended this strategy to many students because smartphones occupy such a significant place in modern life. Every day we interact with menus, notifications, settings, and applications. When these elements appear in English, they provide gentle and repeated exposure to useful vocabulary. At first, the experience may feel unfamiliar. Gradually, however, many words become automatic because they are encountered so frequently. Learning begins occurring naturally through daily interaction. Listening to English stories each morning can also create a powerful routine. I personally love beginning the day with language because mornings often establish the tone for everything that follows. Imagine spending 10 minutes listening to an interesting story while drinking tea or coffee. The goal is not to understand every word perfectly. The goal is to immerse yourself in the rhythm, sounds, and flow of the language. Over time, listening comprehension improves almost invisibly. The ears become more familiar with pronunciation patterns, and understanding begins arriving more naturally. Another habit I frequently recommend is writing short diary entries in English. Many learners initially resist this idea because they worry about making mistakes. Yet a diary is a private space designed for expression rather than perfection. You might write a few sentences about your day, your plans, your feelings, or something interesting that happened recently. The content does not need to be extraordinary. What matters is the act of using English to describe your own experiences. This practice strengthens vocabulary, reinforces sentence structures, and encourages direct thinking in English. I once worked with a student who wrote only 3 or 4 sentences each evening before going to bed. The entries were simple and often contained errors, yet she maintained the habit consistently for an entire year. When she later reviewed her earlier writing, she was amazed by the difference. Her sentences had become longer, clearer, and more natural. The transformation had not occurred because of any dramatic breakthrough. It had occurred because she showed up every day and gave herself another opportunity to practice. Consistency quietly accumulated into progress. Throughout this journey, we have repeatedly discussed courage. Courage appeared when you accepted imperfection and introduced yourself using simple language. Courage helped you start conversations, ask questions, and navigate unfamiliar situations. Yet courage alone is not enough. A single act of bravery can begin a journey, but persistence is what allows that journey to continue. Persistence means returning to the process even when motivation feels weak. It means continuing despite temporary setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt. There will inevitably be days when progress feels invisible. You may listen to a video and understand less than you expected. You may struggle to remember vocabulary that seemed easy yesterday. You may hesitate during conversations and wonder whether improvement is truly happening. Growth is often occurring beneath the surface long before it becomes obvious. Just as a tree develops roots before producing visible branches, language skills often strengthen quietly before revealing themselves clearly. Every person has a different answer. Some want better career opportunities. Some dream of traveling confidently. Others hope to connect with people from different cultures or access knowledge available in English. Whatever your reason may be, it deserves respect because it represents the personal meaning behind your effort. When motivation weakens, returning to that original reason can provide renewed direction and purpose. I often describe this original reason as a North Star. Throughout history, travelers use stars to navigate across great distances. Challenges will appear. Some days will feel easier than others. Yet your deeper purpose can continue guiding you forward even when the path becomes difficult. The stronger your connection to that purpose, the easier it becomes to maintain long-term consistency. As I reflect on everything we have shared across these lessons, I am reminded of the many students whose journeys transformed not only their language abilities, but also their confidence in themselves. They began with fear, uncertainty, and self-doubt. They worried about mistakes and questioned their abilities. Yet through repeated action, they gradually discovered something important. Confidence did not arrive first. Confidence emerged as a result of continuing to act despite uncertainty. The process itself created the confidence they had been searching for. This brings us to the final lesson I want you to carry beyond these pages. Confidence is not magic. It is not a mysterious gift reserved for a fortunate few. Confidence is built through action, strengthened through courage, and sustained through persistence. Every conversation you attempt, every sentence you practice, every story you listen to, and every small step you take contributes to that growth. The mountain of language may appear enormous when viewed from a distance, but every climber reaches the summit one step at a time. Keep moving forward, trust the process, remain patient with yourself, and remember that each small step carries you closer to the person you hope to become. The journey continues, and your next step begins today. Before we finish today's lesson, I want you to remember something very important. The difference is not that they were more talented. The difference is that they kept going when things felt difficult. If today you learned just one new phrase, understood one new idea, or gained a little more confidence than yesterday, then you are already moving forward. Progress in English is not measured by giant leaps. It is measured by small steps taken consistently, day after day, even when nobody else notices. I am truly grateful that you spent your time learning with me today. Whether you are studying for work, travel, school, or simply to build a better future for yourself, I want you to know that every effort you make matters. Keep believing in yourself, keep practicing, and never be afraid to speak imperfectly. If you enjoyed this lesson and want more real English conversations, practical speaking lessons, and step-by-step guidance to help you become a confident English speaker, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new lesson. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are learning English from and what your biggest challenge is right now. I read your comments, and I would love to hear your story. Take care, keep learning, keep speaking, and I'll see you in the next lesson.